Before introducing the speakers, I just wanted to make a few introductory remarks, which is first of all to say I'm absolutely delighted that we're hosting this event, but also we're using this event to promote something which is very rare in our industry and our field, which is good news on education. And we have a series of studies which have really tried to capture some of the policies and conditions under which countries from very different starting points have made progress in development. So, yeah, I think these are terribly important stories, not just in their own right, but in terms of how we think about the challenges looking towards the post-2015 agenda and towards 2030. I'm not going to try and summarize the various studies, because partly because Susan will do a much better job of that than I will. But I do want to take a few minutes to set out what I see as some of the big issues at stake. I've been increasingly struck over the past few years at the way in which the economic growth narrative has sort of returned to the education debate, and in some ways subsumed education. You know, looking across a range of donors, you know, you increasingly see a sort of storyline which really emphasizes growth and productivity as a sort of corrective to what is sometimes presented as a sort of over-focus on human capital development and social development back in the 1990s and after the MDGs. And, you know, I'm a strong advocate of putting growth at the center of any agenda for development. But it does strike me that there's something rather damaging and worrying about this tendency to separate out the two things, growth and human development. Partly because I'm a historian, not an economist, that I often look to historical examples. And there's a great study by Claudia Goldin and Lawrence on the rise of the US as the preeminent economy internationally after 1900. And that story is essentially a story of education advantage. The US invested more heavily in getting more children through primary school into secondary education than any other industrialized country. And there's been a whole range of studies which have documented the growth benefits of that early investment. Now that was then. And I think if you look towards the reality of the global economy today and of national progress, that it's increasingly contingent on knowledge-based labor markets, on skills development, which are delivered through education. You know, and I think you see this with the rise of the success stories in East Asia. So, you know, the idea that we should be separating the growth agenda from the human development agenda, I think, is profoundly mistaken. I think also that it's increasingly evident that whatever goals are ultimately adopted for 2030, if those goals are ambitious and if they're going to be achieved, that's not going to happen absent rapid progress in education. You know, I think we all understand the links from education to child survival to, you know, people getting into higher productivity areas that will lift them out of poverty, to political empowerment and many other dimensions of development. So I think, you know, the studies today focus on specific countries, but they speak to a much wider set of concerns about human development and the post-2015 agenda. I think it goes without saying, certainly to everyone in this room, that achieving sustained progress in education is a tough call. Actually, very few countries successfully, you know, have climbed the PISA league tables or the learning achievement league tables and achieved universal primary education and moved towards universal secondary in the poorest parts of the world. And there are many challenges to be addressed. But I want to start, I wanted to mention some aspects of the narrative on education for all, which I find a little bit worrying. The first is what I call the look at Finland syndrome. And this works by identifying the country that comes top of the PISA league table, you know, or near the top of the PISA league table, Finland, Sweden, South Korea, Shanghai, throwing up your hands in horror at the implications for your country, at the rise of these other guys who are doing really well. Sending your education minister to the said countries. I mean, I think it's no coincidence that Michael Gove is a regular visitor to Shanghai to Finland, to in its various manifestations of the education revolution for the UK, of drawing on these different examples. Arne Duncan was the same in the US, actually. That every PISA report would be followed by a trip from Arne Duncan to the best performing country. But the sort of underlying assumption here is that you can borrow, you can take from these successful institutions and somehow implant them back home. And the interesting thing about the narratives that develop around this are the things that get left out. That if you want an education system like Finland, built on the child poverty levels of the United States, it doesn't work. You have to tackle child poverty. These are countries which are not as unequal as the United States and the UK. And I mentioned these specific examples. These are about rich countries, but it also applies to many of the world's poorest countries. There's a huge emphasis you pick up from discussions with policymakers in Africa of looking at successful systems in East Asia and sort of developing a sort of narrative that somehow you can just borrow, implant, and adapt, and it'll work. And I think we now have enough evidence, not just from education but for other areas, that this process of just trying to borrow and copy is not successful. The second aspect of the narrative that I find worrying is the find me a blueprint story. And this is typically a blueprint which offers a sort of one trigger solution to a whole bunch of problems, which can be around school choice or school competition. Do you prefer centralized systems or decentralized systems? Lance Pritchett has developed this analogy of comparing starfish, which are apparently highly decentralized individuals, with spiders who are highly centralized. And I don't know if Lance has a problem with arachnophobia, but the issue here is that surely you need both. You need a strong centre and you need strong devolved functions, because one without the other is actually a blueprint for failure. It doesn't matter how you cut it. So you need both, and I think the dichotomy doesn't work. The third part of the narrative is this: it all happens within the school gates. Our challenges are essentially about fixing what goes on in the classroom within the school. But we know from the PISA studies and from countless studies in developing countries that most school failure is highly predictable on the basis of parental literacy and the social characteristics of children. So I think looking beyond the classroom to the deeper structures of disadvantage that hold children back is absolutely critical. And I do think we failed to focus sufficiently on that issue in the education community. And the fourth area is the quality versus quantity, or the quality versus access debate. The argument that we focus too much on getting children into school after 2000, and now we need to stop concentrating on that and start concentrating on learning. Well, again, we need to do both. You don't learn when you're not in school. Of course, there are plenty of kids who are in school and not learning. But we have 57 million kids who are still out of school, probably 3 times that number who don't complete primary school and make the transition to secondary school. And it does seem to me irresponsible to shift the spotlight away from the desperate needs, unmet needs of those children. In terms of looking ahead towards the post-2015 agenda, there are a bunch of issues that I know we're going to focus on today. But to mention a few that I do think are absolutely critical, that if we're serious about post-2015 goals, we better get serious about finishing the job, finishing the 2015 goals. And we're only going to do that with a strengthened focus on the most marginalised children. That if you ask the question, who is out of school today? We've had great success in getting children into school, but the next mile is always harder than the last mile. And I think now we're running up against the buffers of kids who are out of school because they're in labour markets, because they're forced into early marriage, because they live in the most remote and disadvantaged parts of a country or in informal urban slum settlements. And I think most education strategies are conspicuously failing to address the particular needs of those children. I think another priority is we need to think more about planning for the next step than planning for the big leap. We need to go from where we are to somewhere better, to think about, what are the institutions that we need to get the remaining children into school, to climb the league table, not to start looking like Finland, which is an unattainable goal and a prescription for failure. I think specifically what that means in many countries is a strengthened focus on early childhood, on first-generation learners, of kids who are coming into school with no parental literacy at home, and the development of institutional mechanisms that facilitate progress, like school assessment systems, teacher support, strengthening the status of teachers, and so on. Third, and I know this is an area that's going to be discussed a lot today, so I'll just touch on very briefly, is to strengthen the focus on equity. That if you want schools to become vehicles for greater social mobility and for reduced inequality, you have to focus on tackling the disparities that produce unequal outcomes. I would just give us one very simple example. If you look at a case like Finland, they invest very heavily on getting the best teachers in the worst schools. There are very few countries that do that. It requires thinking about incentives, about sort of behavioural choices on the part of teachers, thinking about the teacher allocation system, and so on. Secondly, we need systems that allocate financial resources against need. There's a system in most countries, especially low-income countries, which applies straight per capita financing. In other words, kids who are in school will receive a fixed amount, irrespective of their circumstances. And this is sometimes done under the banner of equality. Every child has an equal call on resources if they're in the school system. Well, that's fine, but these kids are starting from very unequal positions. A kid that enters a school having suffered malnutrition faces different types of problems than a kid who hasn't. So, we need to be much better at developing progressive financial systems to underpin education for all. Last, and I think this is really key, we've got very good as an education community at focusing on the things that need to happen in order to achieve the goals. We know the financing requirements. We have a huge body of literature from randomized control trials and other studies on the types of policies that work. We're pretty hopeless at identifying the political coalitions that can actually make it happen. Brazil made the breakthrough in education not because all of a sudden somebody spotted smart pieces of research that told you how to do it, but because you had 3 generations of political leaders who carried forward a shared project across political cycles and delivered results. So I think you're thinking about the politics of achieving good quality education for all is key. So with that, with those remarks, what I'd like to do now is to pass on to Susan Nicolai, who's head of the Development Progress Project, who's been doing the extraordinary job of keeping this whole show on the road over quite a long period now. And Suzanne Grant-Lewis, who's going to act as a discussant. So Susan, over to you.